everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our second Facebook Live Town Hall. I'm here with Vivek Viswanathan, candidate for California Treasurer, as you know. And so now we are currently at 442 miles.
That's right, 447.
Oh, 447. And we are currently making our way through Los Angeles, and you are done with your 20-plus mile days, right?
Exactly, that's right. We're now in LA County. We're in, maybe not quite the home stretch, but we're getting to the home stretch, and we've covered a lot of ground, and we're very excited to take the questions today.
Yeah, so we've got a lot that we never got to from the first Facebook Town Hall, so we wanted to address some of those before we take some new questions. So question number 1 from Neil in San Francisco. Can you talk about the state's fiscal position? How have we done under Jerry Brown, and where do we go from here? What do we need to do to keep growing stronger?
So that's a really important question, because when Governor Brown came in, we had a $27 billion budget deficit, and we wondered, how are we ever going to get out of this? And it took a lot of really hard decisions over a number of years, but right now we're in pretty good shape. So we have $8.4 billion in our rainy day fund. That's going to have another constitutionally mandated deposit of $1.6 billion, bringing us to $10 billion. And then we have a $6 billion surplus on top of that. Mm-hmm. The governor proposes putting $3.5 billion of that into our rainy day fund as a supplemental deposit. So we'll have $13.5 billion at the end of the next fiscal year. So that's very good, and we have this surplus, and the legislature is proposing multiple ways in terms of how do we spend it. We can put it into higher education, we can make community college tuition free, we can make sure that undocumented residents across California have access to Medi-Cal coverage. There are a number of good things that we can do. So this year right now, we're good. But I think what Neil is asking about is, how do we make sure that we don't get back into that situation that we were before?
Right.
And there's a couple things that we need to do. First of all, we want to make sure that we keep filling up that rainy day fund, because $13.5 billion is a lot of money. But we were just saying when the governor came in, it was $27 billion deficit. Mm-hmm. And the Legislative Analyst Office, which is a nonpartisan office that issues reports and forecasts about California's fiscal condition, suggests that even in a mild recession or moderate recession, revenues for the general fund can drop by about $20 billion every year. So we want to fill up that rainy day fund. We want to make sure that we broaden the base of our tax system so that our revenue is not so volatile year after year and not so tied to the stock market. And that's one of the things I've proposed, some ways on how to do that. The last 2 things that we want to do is make sure that when we are proposing to spend new revenue, and there are so many places where we need to invest more in higher education, we need to invest more in K-12 education. Yeah. We have a big housing crisis all across the state where housing costs are double the national average. We need to make sure that the nearly 3 million people in California who don't have health care have access to that coverage. We need to invest in our roads, our bridges, our dam safety. So there's a lot still, even though a lot of things in California are going well, that we need to do. So we need to think of ways to raise that money. And finally, last but especially not least, and as treasurer, I sit on a number of really important boards if I'm fortunate to be elected, we need to take account of our long-term obligations. So making sure we ramp up our contributions to our retirement funds and make sure that CalPERS and CalSTRS are on stable footing. We continue the governor's push to pre-fund retiree health care benefits. Mm-hmm. And these are the decisions, I often noticed in politics that budget decisions are made over 1 year. Election cycles happen every 2 years, but a lot of the really important decisions happen over a 5, 10, or even 20-year time frame. So that's the kind of perspective that I hope to bring as the next treasurer.
Great. Our second question is from Sheila in SF. How do we get big money out of politics?
So that is really important, and in some ways, the thing that is really driving this campaign. I decided at the start that I want to run a campaign without any corporate contributions, without any political action committee contributions, and without any other special interest contributions. Because I think if there's one thing that we've seen over the last couple of years, and this is on both sides of the aisle, it is the loss of trust in American politics and in American institutions. And so much of that has to do with the corrupting influence of big money. And so there's no easy way to do this. We know the Citizens United decision will be difficult to overturn, especially now that Donald Trump has put a new conservative nominee on the U.S. Supreme Court. But there are a couple things that we can do. Number 1, I think more candidates should run without that commitment. No corporate money, no corporate PAC money. And I've decided in my case, no PAC money of any type. I just want to make sure that people who donate to me know that they're supporting a campaign in which you have someone who's qualified and is going to do the right thing, and big money won't be corrupting that process. The second thing we need to do is push for structural reforms to our political system. In California, that would mean banning corporate contributions directly to candidates. And it would also mean instituting a public finance system. And that can go in one of two ways, either of which would be really productive. You either match small dollar donations. So when someone gives $25 or $50 or $100 to a political candidate, the government kicks in money to supplement that. So you're essentially rewarding candidates who raise money from small dollars rather than the less than 1% of Americans who give most of the money to our political candidates. The other thing you can do is actually give money directly to citizens so that they can give to the candidates of their choice without necessarily having to reach into their own pocket. So I think that's really important too, because then you broaden the base of who's actually influencing and spending on our elections. And I think both of those things would go a long way toward increasing participation in our political system. Now, it would cost some money up front, right? If we have public financing of candidates, that of course would involve public money. But I think the payoff would be immense. You know, they often say the reason lobbyists are so active in Sacramento and in Washington is it's that the best investment that they can make. They contribute a little bit of money and then they get a lot. And we saw that with the tax program that Trump just signed into law, where it was basically a giveaway to special interests at the expense of everyday Americans, including so many people here in California. So I think that's what we can do. And if we keep pushing the system, we can make a difference here in California and then ultimately make a difference across the country. And we need to make sure we overturn Citizens United, even if it takes a constitutional amendment.
And what was incredible was when we, went to those indivisible meetings in the Central Valley, people coming up to you and giving you, $20, $40, even though they were unemployed, even though, they were grappling with a lot of financial burden. And to me, that was really inspiring that they saw that this was something they could have an
It's
impact
really
on.
special for me, and I remember we were in Visalia, and after we spoke over there, one woman came up to me, on a pension, on a fixed income, and wrote a contribution. Another who was a school bus driver who contributed to the campaign. And it really means a lot. I'm, of course, making sure, we're running a pretty bare bones campaign. Yeah. We're doing everything we can to stretch every dollar.
We're a very lean team.
Exactly, a team of three. But in addition to that, I think it's important that those are the people who politics should be about, right? And we meet those people along the road, and we want to make sure that the system is representing them. And while, there's a lot that, the everyday public thinks about politics that is not necessarily always right, that fundamental diagnosis that too often the system is working for the special interests rather than them, that is too often correct. And money is at the root of that. So if we can take on this issue, it will make every other issue that we talked about so much easier.
Yeah. So question number 3, Lily Fryer from LA says, I saw that you had a large part in organizing the Global Climate Action Summit along with the governor. What are your main objectives for the summit, and what would you like to see as the outcome in order to deem the summit successful?
So that is really, I was just up in Sacramento yesterday. So my former boss, an incredible woman, the governor's chief of staff, Nancy McFadden, passed away earlier this spring. So we went up to Sacramento yesterday, and in one of the eulogies, they talked about the last couple of weeks of Nancy's life, and they said, what do you want to do with your remaining time? And she said, well, first of all, we need to make sure that Global Climate Action Summit is a success. And so, she was the most amazing person, and she understood to that question how important this is, because when we have a president who's basically abdicating responsibility on this issue on which the future of the planet depends, it's up to all of us, especially in places like California, to step up. And the governor, of course, has played a leadership role. And so what we're doing in California with the summit is we're bringing thousands of people from all over the world and saying, no matter what happens in Washington, no matter what happens everywhere, people, communities, businesses, investors, as the governor says, scientists and mathematicians, we can all step up on our own and drive ways to reduce emissions. So that's going to what's happened in September, and it's not going to just be a conference where people get together and talk, but they're actually going to be commitments that people make to reduce emissions, not only till 2020, not only till 2025, which is the extent of the Paris Agreement when we're looking at our initial targets, but even beyond then, so that we can keep carbon emissions and temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius over the upcoming decades. So there really is no important issue for our planet and here for the future of California, where even in the last year, we've seen the impact of climate change in the drought, in these devastating wildfires, and coastal flooding that's projected for the California coast. So this is going to be a key moment for this governor, who's one of the most historic and legendary governors in California's history, for our state, and really for the entire planet. So I'm so glad I heard from everybody who I spoke with that is on track into the mid-September, and hopefully it'll drive the debate going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time on the East Coast, and coming on this journey with you and driving through Central Valley, seeing all the wind farms, seeing all the solar panels, like that's just so refreshing how much California is a leader in this field.
Exactly. And I want to say one more thing about that, which is that now, unfortunately, and this reflects the way our national politics has been polarized, but climate change has become a partisan issue. And it doesn't need to be that way. It shouldn't be that way. And one thing that's special about California is it really isn't that way in so many respects. And we have more to do, but when the governor passed an extension of the cap and trade effort, which Nancy McFadden helped lead the negotiations to do that, it was a group of Republicans who actually helped to bring that bill into law and voted for it. And actually, former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's a Republican, appeared with Governor Brown at the signing ceremony at Treasure Island and saying that this is not a partisan issue. This is for the future of our state. So if we can continue to build that movement, that's how we can really change it.
Yeah, and that's how it should be.
Yeah.
So question 4, Justine from San Diego, and this is a question we didn't get to from last week, but Justine says, I'm sure not a lot of us know what power you would actually hold to change California. So what can you do to help ease student loan debt? Can you do anything to ease the unintended consequences of Prop 13 from the 1970s? I realize that was a really big chunk of question I just gave you.
Sure. So I'll say, I think they dejected 3 questions in there, and I'll talk very briefly about each of them. First is, what are the powers of the Treasurer's Office? And so that's a question I get a lot because this is a statewide constitutional office. It's been around for more than 150 years, and yet many people don't really know what the Treasurer does, who the Treasurer is. So first I'll say the Treasurer does a lot. You issue the state's bonds, billions of dollars every year. You invest the state's assets, and as I discussed, you sit on a number of really important boards that have a lot of leverage over all aspects of life in California, as well as issues really around the whole country. So that's number one. Second, specifically on student loans and the cost of education, the Treasurer oversees the state's 529 college savings account program, ScholarShare, the investment board. And so one of my goals is to open an account for every baby born in California. So right now we have over 300,000 accounts in that system, but right now there are more babies than that in California born every single year. So if we can do that and help people, and we want to do it for newborns, but people in their teens, people who are adolescents, if we can start to put in money for them and encourage their families to put in money, whatever they can afford as well, that account can grow over time, and then it lessens the burden at the back end if they are able to go to community or four-year college. So that's one thing. The second thing, and to his credit, the current treasurer, John Chung, has pushed a bill to refinance student loans. So often we have these students who have taken out private loans, and they're paying these sky-high rates that are much more than they should be paying, and especially they're doing what we want them to do. They're getting an education. So this was a policy I pushed for as a member of Hillary Clinton's policy team, and when we merged our plan with Senator Bernie Sanders' plan before the Democratic National Convention, it said, let's refinance these loans at current rates so that people aren't stuck in these sky-high rates that they were when they took out the loan. And you can refinance a home loan, you can refinance a car loan. We thought, well, you should be able to refinance your student loans as well, and those can be federal student loans, and in this case, especially on the state level, those could be private student loans. We had more than 50 votes in the Senate to pass that, but of course in the Senate you need 50, so unfortunately it was blocked. But Senator Elizabeth Warren, who was a key sponsor of this measure, said, well, if we can't do it at the federal level, let's try to do that in individual states and make sure that these students get the relief that they need. So I want to be a champion for that issue. The last thing I'll say on Proposition 13, there are a couple of ways to go at this. I think the key issue is how do we make sure that our local governments, and especially our schools, which at one point our public schools were among the best funded and best public schools in America. And since the time of Prop 13, whatever the merits of pushing for some stabilization for homeowners, in fact, we've seen that it really hurt our schools in a way that they've never quite recovered. So what I want to do, first of all, is pursue what's called as a split roll, which is that commercial property, often the owners of these properties have exploited loopholes in the system to pay well below the market assessed value, whereas new entrants and new businesses are having to pay much higher taxes, even though they may be operating in the same business or among the same types of plots of land. So we need to close that loophole, and there is a ballot measure to do just that. My latest understanding is that was initially being qualified for the 2018 ballot. Now it's looking like it'll be for the 2020 ballot. So it'll be a very contentious measure. Prop 13 has often been described as the third rail of California politics, which means you touch it and you die. I totally get, now that I'm a candidate myself, why no one really wants to talk about it. Even Governor Brown himself, who is a hero of mine, has said it is a sacred doctrine that shall not be questioned. But the fact is, we do have to have some of these hard conversations. And when it comes to Prop 13, there are key concerns on both sides. We have to make sure that homeowners in their homes are protected, and we want to make sure that no one faces these bills where they feel like they're going to be thrown out of their homes. And we met some of those people along the way, including one memorable conversation that I had in Modesto when I was coming along this run. At the same time, we need to make sure that we have the funding that our schools need, and we need to make sure that the wealthiest people in California are paying their fair share.
The next question is also a question from last week, question from Jayashri. What feedback did you get while you're running across California? So for those of you who are just now tuning in, Vivek is actually on this 500-mile journey across the state from Sacramento to San Diego, but we recently calculated it and we think it'll be more like 650 miles. So we're at 447. We're actually crossing the 500-mile mark this week in LA. What feedback did you get, Vivek?
Yeah.
I mean, you've been chased by a lot of dogs. You've
That's
been
right.
eating a ton of burritos to power your run through California.
So first of all, it came from one of our friends, Public. I think on the very first or second day, it was wear a hat. I've been putting on my sunscreen, but it's hot out there. Well, actually, that first day we had a ton of rain, and we were walking.
I would say first week.
Yeah, it was just rain,
pouring.
just pouring rain, lightning, thunderstorms.
Yeah.
So I brought a very strong umbrella, and then of course the sun came out, and that Central Valley heat that we're now so familiar with. Dry heat, as everyone told me in Sacramento, so it is good. You can run through it. But that was one. And of course, making sure to stay safe out there and watching my surroundings.
Avoid coyotes. We
Exactly.
that.
There was one, a driver told me, made sure to avoid that coyote, which I did. And making sure to pay attention. A lot of people ask me, do you listen to podcasts or things like that? Usually when I do those, I just run or walk without headphones. It helps me keep aware of my surroundings. And it also means I could stop along the way and talk to people. And even if there are, on these long stretches where there aren't people, it's a time to take it all in. This is a unique way to get the pulse of California. I'm hoping other candidates who are running, especially statewide in California, maybe don't have to go 500 or 600 miles, but you get a sense of walking on foot, of what a community is really like, how they change, right? From Elk Grove to Galt to Stockton to Manteca, all the way down to where we are right now. So that's really special. And then, on a substantive level, beyond some of the issues on people's minds, and we've talked about some of those in this conversation already, I think I also just got a sense of the kindness and the kind of people that we met out there. And that's true in so many different parts of the state and really across the country. And it's easy to lose that in the back and forth of the political conversation, especially in Washington right now. But I will always take those moments with me. And I still remember there was just one day where the weather was just so much warmer. I ended up going a lot slower than I did. And I came close to running out of water. And I was going to be fine. I was going to finish. But I felt, I could really use some extra water. And I stopped by at a crossroads, and there was an older gentleman selling flowers on the side of the road and hoping to make a little bit of money. And I came over to him and I said, hey, I'm not going to have any flower. I'm not going to buy any flowers, but do you possibly have any additional water? We're in these long stretches of farms. And he didn't understand at first because I was speaking English and he spoke Spanish. But I pointed to my empty water bottle and he said, oh, got it. And then he went over to his backpack very slowly. He was an older gentleman, pulled out a fresh, cold bottle of water and gave it to me. And he refused to take my money. And I finally gave him a couple of dollar bills and I said, you have to take this. And even though language-wise we couldn't communicate, it was one of the most special experiences.
And you ran away, right?
That's right, because he kept trying to give the money back. And I'm like, no, please, you've been so kind to me. But I think that's that example of that spirit. And if we can cultivate a little bit more of that in California, the fact that we can can pursue a politics of the common good and that we're all in this together. And if I could, in my own little way, bring a little bit of that spirit in this campaign, then I think we'll have done our job, no matter what happens on election day.
And I think that's been so incredible as, a bystander, hearing your stories after I pick you up from your run, you're saying that this person tried to get me in their car because they're like, what are you doing? Or,
That's right. And I know you, Annie, as well. We had, you filmed Summer, the student who we just put out a video about at UC Merced, who's a first-generation college student. And there's so many of those stories along the way. And if we can do our part to lift those up, that'll be really special.
Yeah. And I just want to also put in a plug for, before you embarked on this run, you spoke with Christina Lee, who is this remarkable woman who ran across the entire country raising money for the Navy SEALs. And we were like, okay, what advice do you have before we embark on this crazy journey? And I remember, she would give us advice on, blisters, on there's just no dignity when you're on the road for long stretches at a time. But it was just so eye-opening because there are certain things you just wouldn't expect that you need to know before you embark on 500 miles.
Yeah, and one other thing I'll say that Christina said, we asked, because we finally done it now, but we crossed over the Tehachapi Mountains and then over the Sierra Pelona Mountains, coming into Santa Clarita. And we asked her, well, when you were on this run, what about these mountains? And she said, go over them. Yeah. So that's what we've done.
Yeah. So next question from Jim. Our generation is gravitating towards a more automated job field. Technology is displacing several jobs now and in the imminent future, especially with the emergence of robotics and AI. What will you do to combat this? And what are your thoughts on universal income?
So on the first question, which is how do we make sure that Californians are prepared for the jobs of the future? Exactly what Jim was talking about. The job mixes are changing. Mm-hmm. The idea that you join a company and you spend 35 or 40 years with that company is clearly going out the door in favor of a much more flexible work environment, which increases productivity, but also produces a lot of the dislocations that Jim was talking about. So what do? Number one, we have to invest more and more in education. And institutes have projected that over the next decade, California will face a shortfall of 1.1 million college graduates. Mm-hmm. And those are 4-year degrees. And then in addition, we have to make sure to improve opportunities for people facing 2-year degrees and then improve the K-12 system. Right now, we still don't have universal preschool in California. So if you're not giving people a good start in life, that makes it much more harder that they'll be able to adapt to this new work world. So we need to invest more in that. But second, and as important, we need to rethink how we're delivering those educational models. Because the fact is, just like the idea of joining a company and spending 35 or 40 years at that company has really gone out the door, the same thing can be said about education itself, where you graduate and you finish college and you're done learning. Because the world is changing, we have to change, and all of us have to adapt. And what's incumbent for government is to make sure that people have those opportunities, rather than having people feel adrift and that they're on their own. So that can mean continuing education. That can mean our community colleges partnering with local businesses and firms in the community. It can also mean online community college, which the governor has proposed in his new budget to roll that out over a period of years so that people can access that type of education even if they're already in the workforce. Mm-hmm. And then the last thing I'll say about that is we need to have a conversation to how to make sure that credentials are matched to the right jobs and different types of credentials are available. So there is this idea among some people that you need a 4-year college degree or else, what can we do or how can we hire you? And it is correct that we want to make sure that we get as many 4-year college degrees as we can because those really do pay off. We talked about that shortfall. At the same time, there are many ways to have a good life and get a good education and provide value here in California and here in America. And we need to recognize those different pathways. We need to put money behind them. We need to experiment with new models using technology to deliver more value at less cost without losing the human-to-human interaction that has always been at the heart of education. So the last thing I'll say is that for me, one important job of the treasurer, by virtue of issuing the state's bonds, you're actually most sensitive to any changes in the state's credit rating. Mm-hmm. And that, at one level reflects future projections of the state's budget and revenue. It also, at a broader level, our credit rating reflects people's view of our economic future. And there's no more important issue for our economic future than making sure, as Jim said, that when this job mix changes, that people aren't prepared only for the jobs of yesterday or today, but tomorrow. So that will be a prime responsibility of my job if I'm elected as treasurer.
Right. And then Oh, I'm just looking at the time now. So this will probably be the last question to wrap up, but from Allison. California's university system is unparalleled and provides opportunity to so many. But despite rising tuition costs, many face funding shortfalls. How do you see balancing higher education spending with so many areas in the state, like infrastructure, housing, etc., that need resources?
So that is a tough question, because one thing that I recognized when I spent my time up in Sacramento working in the governor's office is that even though you have a general fund of over $130 billion, money is in fact very tight up there. And every program, it's very tough to get the money to do that. And of course, to raise taxes in California, because of Proposition 13, you need a 2/3 vote. And I saw the governor do that twice in this past year. Number one, to raise the gas tax in line to adjust for the purchasing power it had lost over the last 2 decades so that we could repair our roads, bridges, and other critical infrastructure. And number two, to extend the cap and trade program, which we had talked about, and that required a 2/3 vote as well. And those 2/3 votes are no easy lifts. We talked about how with cap and trade, we needed Republican votes to bring that along. And in a way, it shouldn't be easy to raise taxes. We want to make sure that if we're asking voters for more money, we're spending it well. But the fact is, my view after spending my time up there is we do need ways to get more revenue. Because over the last couple of years, on a per student basis, not only since in the last 15 years has, for example, at the University of California, tuition has gone up more than twofold, and that's after adjusting for inflation. And you meet people on the trail who, 50 years ago when they went to the University of California, they spent $50 or $100 for a semester on tuition, and it's amazing. And those days might not come back, but it shouldn't be this hard.
Right.
And so you wonder that, and at the same time, spending has been crowded out by other priorities, right? And we have to invest in K-12 education. One thing that we're finally beginning to rectify, but we were talking before about the school to prison pipeline that we have to disrupt and turn into a cradle to college pipeline. But the fact is, over the last 30, 35 years, we've built more than 20 new state prisons in California. And too often the money has been going there rather than to these developmental priorities. And so UC, CSU, community colleges, courts and parks and mental health and social services, those often get crowded out. So I've proposed a couple ways to get more revenue into the system. California used to have an inheritance tax, and in fact, at the federal level, they've repealed part of the inheritance tax for estates between over $5 million. I think it would take a ballot measure, but we can bring that back in California to make sure the wealthiest pay their fair share. Yeah. We talked about Proposition 13 and making some changes with the split roll so that commercial property owners can no longer exploit these loopholes. If that were enacted, it would bring in several billions of dollars a year to reinvest in our schools. I also think, and this would be a tough lift, but we need to broaden the base of the sales tax, which right now focuses mostly on goods, to include some high-end high-end business services, so we can invest in social priorities and educational priorities, and that way we can reduce, and I hope one day eliminate public college tuition for working families. So none of this will be easy. We have to bring in more revenue, but one of the things to go back, to end it this way, go back to that question about campaign finance reform. I think if we elect politicians and elected leaders who aren't dependent on big money, then voters can be more confident that they can trust those people, and they can trust those people to look out for them and not divert the money for other uses or special interest groups. And once you have those leaders in there who you can trust, then when that leader comes to you and says, hey, I know you might feel like you're paying a lot in taxes, but we have a lot of problems on education and healthcare and social services that we need to attack. And this is the way we're going to do it. We need a little bit more money, but it will be spent well. This tax will be progressive. The wealthiest will pay the highest share, but we need a little bit for everyone to chip in. I think that bargain becomes a little bit easier because you've established that trust. And then we can reinvest in UC and CSU and our community colleges and make sure that those universities are no longer turning thousands of people away. We can make tuition lower, hopefully one day make it free, and then improve those graduation rates. And when you do that, that's not just better for those students, that's better for everyone across the state. That tide will lift all boats, and we'll make sure that California is the strongest state in the union. And that's ultimately what we want to do, because politics at the national level is so stuck right now, but we could still build something really great in California. It's a great state. We've now run almost 500 miles across it, and it makes me so excited at what we're going to do.
Yeah, and I mean, I just get so frustrated when I see what you talk about how it's so easy to cut funding from education and all these other services and mental health when that is so critical. And we see all these teachers across the United States walking out because they're in these appalling conditions. And as someone who is also a first-generation college student, my parents were refugees from the Cambodian genocide. And to see where they came to the U.S. and to where I am now because of my education has been just incredible. And everyone should have that opportunity.
That's right. It's an incredible story, but what we need to do is find the public policies and the structural changes to replicate that story. So we can create Annies all across California.
I don't know if I want an army of Annies. But thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. We're sorry we went a little over time, and there's still some questions left over, but we'll save it for the next town hall. We want to do these about every week. So Vivek will be running again tomorrow, continuing his 500-mile run, and we are so excited to be in LA, especially to try all these ice cream places that people have suggested. We've already tried a handful. We're going to get back to you about which ones we like the most. We'll also be... Okay. I have one question that I really want to take, but from Richard, who is one of our most avid fans. Richard says, what's the most memorable thing to date from your walk across the state?
The most memorable thing to date from the walk across the state. Wow, there's so many.
He runs too, Richard. I promise he runs.
There are so many that it's hard to choose, but I think one thing, and I'll say this because we've already talked about the people that we've met.
Yeah.
So I'll just say, just talking about the geographical diversity of the state. And, we started in Sacramento at the treasurer's office, right across from the state capitol, the seat of government for a state that has a GDP of $2.6 trillion. The sixth biggest economy in the world. And then we're going right through farmland for the Central Valley. And then I guess, maybe because it's freshest in my mind right now, but climbing over, foot by foot, and I was walking at this point, step by step, but the Tehachapi Mountains, and then climbing over, right, close to where we were, and just seeing how high you can go and how beautiful it was. And you've got the valley on one side, and then you've got San Gabriel, and then coming into LA County, and then the biggest county in America on the other was really memorable. It gave us a sense of the scale of this state, how beautiful it is, and how, if we get the right policies in place, how many people it can affect.
Yeah, it's nuts how much California changes along the Central Valley, along the coast. It's beautiful.
And then the last thing I'll say about that, because we've talked a lot in this conversation about the environment, is one thing on a personal level, and I crossed the Pacific Crest Trail as I was coming over and met with some people who often take care of, often those people, they've got the real blisters. I may be running 500, 600 miles, they're going, 1,100 or 1,200 miles. But, you learn a lot about, learning about the environment and how important it is to protect it and preserve what we have and what we're building for future generations. Because ultimately, amid the din and the noise of the political election cycle, you do have to remember that that's what it's about. And walking on those mountains and along the valley really gives you a sense of the scale in which we're just doing our little part to get it right.
Yeah, so thank you for the last question, Richard. We also want to say we really love your puns and they really brighten our day. But now we're really, really wrapping, I promise. I know I have a tendency to keep taking the last question because all these great questions I want Vivek to get to. But we will see you next week.
And keep those ice cream recommendations coming, right? Thank you.